History has taught us that power should always be sought in the same places, in crowns, thrones, armies, and flags waving over conquered lands. Yet one of the most powerful actors in medieval Europe needed none of these. It had no king, no capital, no standing army, and no single ruler issuing decrees. Nevertheless, it set prices, dictated access to markets, punished kings, and decided which cities would prosper and which would retreat into obscurity. Its influence stretched from London to Novgorod, from the North Sea to the depths of the Baltic. This wasn't an empire. It was a network, a merchant cartel that had grasped something most rulers hadn't yet understood. If you control trade, you don't need to control land. Power will come to you. To understand how the Hanseatic League emerged, we must set aside the romantic image of medieval Europe. This wasn't a continent of stable kingdoms and orderly markets. It was fragmented, violent, and unreliable. Following the fall of Roman authority, Northern Europe became a patchwork of weak states, competing princes, city lords, and piled-up feudal claims. Borders constantly shifted. Laws diverged the moment one crossed a river. Justice depended on who controlled the path one was treading. For merchants, this was not just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Trade existed, but at a brutal cost. Ships encountered pirates in the North Sea and the Baltic. Caravans were subjected to tariffs, confiscations, or outright robbery. A merchant could fill a ship with grain or timber and lose everything before reaching the next port. The reason was not a lack of demand, but a lack of protection. Kings were content to tax trade as it passed through their territories, but far less interested in guaranteeing its security once it extended beyond their reach. Contracts meant little beyond borders. When a deal was broken in a foreign city, there was usually no court willing or able to enforce it. Yet, the profits were too great to ignore. Northern Europe was rich in the resources the rest of the continent needed. Timber for cities and ships, grain to feed growing populations, furs, amber, fish, salt, wool. Demand increased, cities grew, and trade routes formed, whether rulers liked it or not. The problem wasn't demand. The problem was trust. Trust among strangers. Trust between languages, laws, and loyalties. And trust was scarce in this world. Merchants faced a choice: to live in perpetual vulnerability or to build their own systems of protection. The first seeds of the Hanseatic League were not ideological or political, but extremely practical. In the 12th century, merchants from cities like Lübeck and Hamburg began to cooperate informally. They shared ships for safety, traveled in convoys, and warned each other of hostile ports, corrupt officials, and dangerous waters. What began as mutual aid quickly evolved into something more strategic. Cooperation reduced risk. Reduced risk meant lower costs. Lower costs meant higher profits. When merchants realized that cooperation was more profitable than competition, it became difficult to ignore this logic. Over time, these relationships hardened. Cities that hosted and protected merchants gained access to goods, capital, and connections. Cities that did not were marginalized. Trade routes didn't just reflect geography. They reflected trust. And trust began to cluster around certain ports and towns. Lübeck, sitting at a critical crossroads between the Baltic and Inner Europe, became one of the oldest centers. Hamburg, meanwhile, connected river trade to the North Sea. These cities were powerful not because they had armies, but because they were indispensable. The important point to understand here is this: no one sat down and designed the Hanseatic League. There was no founding charter, no declaration. There was no moment when someone declared the creation of a new power block. It emerged, as markets often do, organically driven by incentives. Merchants aligned their behavior because it fit economic logic. Cities supported them because trade brought wealth. Over time, conformity turned into expectation, expectation into rules, and rules into leverage. As these merchant networks expanded, something significant and subtle happened. Trade ceased to be merely an economic activity and became an organizing principle. If enough merchants refused to trade with a city, that city would suffer. Prices would rise, supplies would dry up, income would collapse. Cooperation was enforced not through violence, at least not initially, but through exclusion. In a world dependent on trade, exclusion was devastating. This was the quiet genius of the structure that would eventually become the Hanseatic League. It didn't try to replace states. It circumvented them. It didn't overthrow rulers. It made them dependent. Kings could control land, but merchants controlled access. And access to grain, timber, salt, and credit was far more important than flags fluttering over castles. Slowly, almost invisibly, economic coordination began to override political authority. By the 13th century, these merchant alliances had spread to dozens of cities across Northern Europe. They spoke different languages, were subject to different rulers. But when it came to trade, they increasingly acted as one body. They did so not because they took orders, but because the system rewarded those who conformed and punished those who didn't. This was the birth of a new kind of power, a power that didn't seek legitimacy from God or lineage, a power not based on conquest, a power based on logistics, trust, and collective action. The Hanseatic League wasn't yet a cartel in the modern sense, but the foundations had been laid: common interests, common rules, common outcomes. As this network grew denser and more self-assured, it began to notice something more unsettling. If merchants could protect themselves, coordinate trade, and enforce standards across borders, what were kings really for? As the network expanded, it became harder to ignore power, impossible to dismiss as mere coincidence. They were no longer simply cooperating, they were coordinating. In cities that shared nothing in common politically or technically, they began to standardize contracts, weights, measures, and commercial practices. An agreement made in Bruges could be negotiated in Bremen, prices given in Riga made sense in Cologne. This was not a cultural convergence, but an economic alignment. And this alignment reduced friction in ways that medieval states could not match. The Union's merchants also began to institutionalize their presence abroad. In important foreign cities, they established contours, semi-autonomous trading zones where Hanseatic rules applied instead of local rules. In London, Steelyard, Bruges, and later Antwerp, large Hanseatic communities were established, with Novgorod becoming a key eastern center. These weren't formally embassies, but they served a similar function. They housed merchants, stored goods, resolved disputes internally, and negotiated collectively with local authorities. If a foreign ruler wished to access Hanseatic trade, they would deal with the group, not individuals. This distinction was crucial because once negotiations became collective, the leverage shifted. A single merchant could be pressured, taxed, or ignored. A coordinated network controlling key trade flows, however, could not be ignored. When disputes arose, the Union responded with pressure, not petitions. If a city mistreated Hanseatic merchants or violated agreed-upon terms, the reaction was swift and personal. Trade ceased. Ships changed course, goods were lost. The economic pain was felt immediately and clearly. This was, at least most of the time, an economic war without bloodshed. The genius of the Hanseatic system lay in how little it relied on violence. Violence was costly. Armies required funding, loyalty, and constant maintenance. The Union opted for something cleaner: rejection, exclusion, boycott. These tools didn't require soldiers, but they required discipline. And discipline was achieved not through ideology, but through profit. Cities that deviated from the system lost access to the network, and merchants who violated the rules found themselves isolated. Harmony was rational, not moral. Over time, rulers learned this lesson the hard way. Kings granted privileges, exemptions, or protection to Hanseatic merchants. They did so out of necessity, not generosity. Northern Europe depended on the flow of goods controlled by the League. Grain shortages could destabilize cities, timber shortages could halt shipbuilding, and salt shortages could disrupt food preservation. The League sat at the bottlenecks of all three. When conflicts arose, rulers often discovered that sovereignty meant little when markets turned against them. This did not mean the Hanseatic League was universally loved. Quite the opposite. Local merchants resented its dominance. Rulers resented its autonomy. Cities outside the network accused it of monopolistic behavior, which, to be fair, wasn't entirely wrong. The League fixed prices, restricted access, and coordinated supply. By any modern definition, it acted like a cartel. The difference was that there was no regulatory authority strong enough to stop it. Here's the disturbing part. The Union became powerful, not because it was corrupt or plotting secretly, but because it solved a problem that no one else could. It provided credibility in a world without trustworthy states. It enforced norms in a world without enforceable law. It mitigated risk in a world without security guarantees. People didn't submit to the Hanseatic system because they were forced to. They joined because the alternative was worse. At this point, the story begins to evolve beyond medieval trade and become something far more familiar. The Hanseatic League wasn't just transporting goods. It was organizing expectations, shaping behavior, deciding who had access to markets and under what conditions. And once an institution controls access, it doesn't need a crown to rule. By the 15th century, the Union had become self-assured enough to act as a clear political force. When Danish kings threatened Hanseatic interests in the Baltic, the Union didn't appeal to a higher authority. It assembled a fleet. It blockaded ports and negotiated treaties on equal terms with the monarchs. Danish King Charles IV,
The war against Valdemar ended not with his victory, but with concessions to the League. Commercial privileges were secured, autonomy preserved. A loose coalition of merchants had subjugated a crown to its will. Bringing a king back to the negotiating table demonstrated what limited power meant. Yet, even at its peak, the Hanseatic League never truly became a state. It had no capital, no permanent treasury, no unified military command. Its meetings were regular, but participation was voluntary. Decisions were often slow and contentious. On paper, it seemed fragile. In practice, however, it endured for centuries. Because its strength came not from centralization, but from alignment. The League was held together by a shared understanding. Protect the system, and the system will protect you. This understanding proved far more resilient than loyalty to any single ruler. Cities rose and fell, dynasties collapsed, borders shifted. The League adapted. It redirected trade, shifted centers, and absorbed shocks. It behaved more like a market organism than a government, responsive, pragmatic, and ruthlessly focused on survival. But this adaptability came at a hidden price. As the Union grew more entrenched, it also became more conservative. The rules that once fueled growth began to resist change. New rivals emerged. Southern trade routes expanded. Atlantic trade began to overshadow the Baltic. States began to centralize power, build navies, enforce laws, and grant credit on a scale that merchants could not forever overcome. The same governments that the Union had once left behind were growing. The Hanseatic League did not collapse dramatically. It faded slowly, quietly, as incentives shifted, alternatives emerged, and the balance between state power and market power readjusted. But the lesson it left behind is sharper than ever. You don't need sovereignty to wield power. You need coordination. You don't need armies if you control access. And you don't need ideology if incentives do the work for you. The Hanseatic League did not rule Northern Europe by decree. He ruled out of necessity. And that is often the most enduring form of control.